welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your light strong host, Madelyn.
I'm your, I don't know, I died host Emma.
Fatality
host Emma.
And thanks for tuning in to this week's show. It's a side quest, and it's my turn for a side quest. And so this week, we are going to be talking about martial arts and fighting styles in games. So how are they developed? Are they real? Spoiler, sort of? Sometimes. How can
Parts
that stop?
of.
Yeah, like, there are moves.
Yeah.
Someone could do one of those things.
Yeah.
And, how does that style convey something about the character? What's happening for mechanical reasons? What's happening for aesthetic reasons? What's happening for authenticity reasons? There's a lot going on in games. Would you believe it?
I would not believe it.
So this was inspired by me sitting on the subway being like, what have we not done on a side quest? Which is usually how these things go.
Right.
But it was also inspired by when Emma came up to visit this past weekend. We started Lost Judgment. And just a little bit into Lost Judgment, my pal Kaito says, you've got a new fighting style. Have you been practicing? I don't even remember what he says.
I think Aikido.
Yeah. And he's like, no, it's my style. But that made me think, like, I wonder how these styles are developed. I wonder what, sort of goes into all of that. And, there's not as much about this for a lot of games that's, like, official as you would think.
Yeah. I will say, I think Yagami style is mostly like, this one is the kicky one, and this one is the choppy one.
I did actually watch a martial artist's react to Judgment video. Mm-hmm. So I'll start with a few tidbits from that, because I thought there were some fun tidbits that'll kind of contextualize a lot of what we'll talk about. Here's the one things I wrote down. Grabbing a punch is apparently hard.
Makes sense to me.
So that's a real staple of games that just right off the bat, that's a hard thing to do. They didn't say it was impossible. They were just like, oh, martial arts master over here.
Yeah.
And then they were like, wow, his beard disappeared. One of them spent the whole time being unable to figure out sort of like what style he was using, basically because it's like lots of little things pulled from lots of different styles. Yeah. However, in Judgment, and I watched one for Yakuza 0 too, in Judgment they did seem to be like, oh, this is a real move. That's a real move. They do that in this style. They do this in this style. It's just that they aren't strung together in a way that makes sense or realistic on that scale, but they are real moves. As opposed to some other games where it's just like, that's not real. But there are a lot of like tiny little things in that that you wouldn't think of sort of already, which I think we'll find lots of tiny little things throughout this episode. But they were like, oh, like doing these like costly cool tricks to get up from the ground, which are awesome in a fighting game because you can hit people when you get up. They're like, that's so stupid. You're wasting a ton of energy. You're not hitting anyone. Like, why would you throw yourself up from the ground like that? Or like he looks down when he blocks and they were like, don't do that, that's bad, you can't see what's happening.
Yeah, that's true.
Or also even obviously the RGG games, like many fighting games, have sort of like brutal heat action special moves, but not even those. They were looking at some moves, they were like, oh man, like you punch that guy's like knees like that, he's not walking now. And the length of the fights generally being sort of unreal. So, like, there's just so many things. There's so many things in fighting games, even as we talk about authenticity or lack of authenticity today. It's just like, well, if you really dig in, there's all sorts of weird little things that are like, well, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. And it's all in the name of the game.
Sure, yeah.
But yeah, unsurprisingly, the video on watching Majima's breaker style in Yakuza 0 was a much more like... They were like, if a guy started breakdancing in a fight, I would walk away and let him hurt himself.
But see, that was funny to me because that's like, well, yeah, that fits with what Majima is like, right?
Yeah.
So in some ways, then it's not a realistic fighting style, but it sort of works for the character that you're playing as.
Absolutely.
That he would just like spin around on his head for a little bit.
Yeah.
For
They're
fun.
like, there's no way he can maintain that momentum. Like, you might be able to do those moves, but like the moment you hit someone, like, game over. Anyway, so that was sort of the inspiration behind this episode. I was like, oh, huh, like, is this a real fighting style? And the answer is, in fact, no.
Well, my impression of Kiryu's, at least, has always just been he just punches people. His basic one.
He hits them with bicycles is my fighting style. But yes.
That's true, too. Yeah. You can pick up a bike and hit someone with a bike, theoretically.
It's true. Like. The Reddit thread about this, there's like very much like no information about what these styles actually are. Was Kiryu's is a blend of street fighting, boxing, kickboxing, karate, judo, and wrestling, which is sort of just like, oh, so everything.
Nothing too fancy, though. Well, I don't know, actually. Nothing I perceive of as too fancy.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Akiyama is just kicky.
He's just a kicky boy.
He kick. So that was sort of the start of my research of like, what's real? What's going on here? And the answer is like, well, it's sort of all Bruce Lee. And then it evolved from there.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, like a lot of these like sort of earlier games. I mean, there are literal games. There's literally a game called Bruce Lee in 1984, like an 8-bit Apple game, where I thought this was fun. In the plot, which had the hero fighting through a wizard's temple to secure the secret of immortality. That hero being Bruce Lee, just to be clear.
Right.
Look, some wild movies in Bruce Lee's filmography. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think that he beats up wizards very often.
Probably not.
But a lot of
is that scene in Judgment that you would say they were reacting to, where he throws the beard off? Do they literally? Is it just like? Do they make fun of him for like his kung fu pose, or are they literally like? Or do you think you're Bruce Lee? I can't remember now. For some reason, that was sticking in my mind.
I can tell you that the martial artists certainly made fun of his kung fu pose. And Kaito did like the little arm circle at one point. They're like, nobody does that. I've never seen like you roll your arm and you're warmed up. No.
Man, just crushing dreams today.
That's gonna be the whole episode. The whole episode's gonna be like, that's not how that actually works. Which is okay. And important. I think we'll talk a lot today about how actually if you tried to put together a fighting game that really was very faithful to what an actual fight, like judo fight or like whatever, taekwondo fight would look like, it would probably not be very good.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm sorry. I interrupted you. Continue with your Bruce Lee thoughts.
Yeah, let me continue my Bruce Lee thought. A lot of the early 80s kind of fighting games are very much like, there's the Bruce Lee character. It's sort of it's clearly an homage to this Bruce Lee movie, which makes sense. Like he very much was like the spark of this sort of interest in martial arts, and so of course all of the games are going to emulate like the greatest martial artist. That's no surprise,
for sure.
There's a lot of, I mean, it's interesting, especially. I watched this featurette on the Mortal Kombat movie. It's interesting how many of these, games take inspiration from movies.
Right.
Right? Whether it's Bruce Lee or like Mortal Kombat was originally sort of inspired by, they really liked Jean-Claude Van Damme. And they were like, I want to make a game that's like that. And they made Mortal Kombat. So it's like this weird game of telephone now of like, okay, they were inspired by movies and then they made these games. And now some of these games are getting turned back into movies. Even though it's like you're now like 4 mirrors away from actual martial arts.
That's true. That's funny.
But then having to turn it back into something that like stuntmen at least can do.
Yeah. I think fighting games is the one genre where you will find a lot more. Well, we'll talk about Sifu too, I guess, but fighting games is the one where you'll find a lot more like. You'll find weird ones too, but you'll find ones where they are like particularly based on like a single style. I watched a bunch of compilations of from this one guy of just like different styles represented across different characters in different fighting games, and they would just show like the different takes on the same move within that style that each character does, which was really interesting, because like if I'm just watching fighting games, I'm not noticing that.
I know.
But when you put them all in a row, it's like, oh yeah, they're doing the same. But that's the same move, you know? Like, there might be slight differences in the way that the animation is done, but when you're watching them back to back, you're just like, oh yeah, that's the same thing.
Well, and it makes a lot of sense that in pure fighting games specifically, that you would want to... I mean, one, it would be very hard to just, like, make up 30 distinct fighting styles.
Yeah.
Right? Might as well... Like, let's lean on the guys who've been doing this for thousands of years. Maybe they have some good ideas.
Uh-huh.
But also in fighting games, more so than even in the kind of like brawlery games, like Yakuza, Sifu is based on one sort of specific thing, but like Sleeping Dogs, these like fighting on the streets brawler games. Even in those that have sort of like, oh, you've got the fast style, and you've got the kicky style, and you've got the heavy style, and you've got the weapon style, or whatever. It's not as important as in fighting games that each character feels really distinct. And so a great way to shortcut that, both in terms of fighting style and in terms of giving you something that can reveal the tiniest of something about that character, right, is to say, okay, this guy, like I was reading about this in Street Fighter or Tekken a little bit. It's like, this guy does like lucha libre, like Mexican style wrestling. So like, he's from Mexico. Or like this guy, like Dragunov, does like Russian style sambo fighting. It's like, okay, like their fighting styles being tied to a perhaps very broad stroke sort of stereotypical characterization, but they tell you something that's then can be consistent with the character design, can be consistent with the lore, can be consistent with whatever.
Yeah.
Especially in these games that come from this like foundation of being, you're playing as the American guy or the Japanese guy, and you're going to beat these other guys from other countries. Right? Like,
that is the basis for most fighting games.
Yeah. So it's like, yeah, of course you would want to say like, okay, yeah, let's use Muay Thai, let's use Capoeira, let's use whatever, to characterize these characters that, at least in their like very origins, were very much, they're from this country.
Yeah. I was doing a little bit of like looking at like weapons fighting in video games, but I have to say that the real sword nerds and the martial arts nerds give me very different feelings on YouTube.
Why is that? I didn't do too much digging into the weapons enthusiasts. I
don't know, just something about like a guy being very into like medieval fighting styles for historical accuracy. Tings something in my brain that says bad vibes, bad vibes. I don't know, can't back anything up, but the martial artists seem chiller for whatever reason.
I will say too that all the sort of like martial artists analyze, martial artists react type YouTube content, they mostly seem pretty good natured about it. You know, most of these martial artists, like, they're not getting like karate masters from the mountains to react to this, right? Yeah. People who are martial artists now are content creators, are stuntmen, are whatever, right?
Yeah.
And so even though they're in these videos saying, oh, you know, that's not how you would do this, there's also a lot of them being like, like, that's impossible, but like, how stylish, how sick. So there's definitely, like, I think the commitment to accuracy, the commitment to historical accuracy, is necessarily dampened by the fact that most of these people, like, even if you're an MMA fighter, you're in the entertainment industry, right? Like, they're in the entertainment industry. For most of them, the way they are utilizing these skills has to be, like, mostly fake.
Yeah.
Right? And I say that with the most respect. Like, it's much harder to do things fake than to do them real, I think. but yeah, it was definitely like they appreciate the bombast of it all when it's needed.
But also just the comments on the videos too. Like the compilations I was watching, the one that had like capoeira, sorry, in it was like all comments that was like, you know, they introduced this capoeira character in the fighting game, and it just like exploded in South America. They're like, we're open up capoeira gyms everywhere because it was so cool. And just like reminiscing on that, which was much like just nice. I don't know. It was just like they're just like having fun, appreciating the art, I guess.
I did read a couple of articles about people who are like, I played fighting games as a kid, and now I'm a pro martial artist.
Yeah.
So it does, the circle goes both ways.
Yeah.
Although from what I can tell, there are not a lot of other than in motion capture, which of course, that's a huge other than to say. But not yet do a lot of these games seem to have, like, truly credited choreographers.
Well, that's so interesting because I feel like a lot of these games must do some level of motion capture. But it just, like, I don't know how they do it or what the process of that is like.
Well, you showed the videos for Demon Souls.
Yeah. But like that must have a choreographer, right? That must have somebody who's doing that.
Oh, definitely. I mean, that's what I mean. Like, somebody is choreographing the motion capture.
Yeah.
But, like, not that, like, fight choreographers in movies or whatever are, like, so top billed or anything, right? But in a fighting game, you'd think that the guy, like, choreographing the motion capture would be, like, an important guy. Like, that's kind of the game.
Yeah.
But, the only thing I could really find of, like, oh, that's, like, a person who they're bandying about in the press is the guy who choreographed Sifu. And that's because they were making a really big deal out of how authentic it is. So they wanted to walk their real kung fu master around.
Well, a lot of the time for, like, fighting games and other stuff, like, whatever reference material you have is just, like, a starting point. Because generally, in order to make it readable to the player, you're going to have to exaggerate it, so at least slightly, to either add, a little bit more, like, their arm stretches in a way that a human arm does not, because it looks better that way in animation, because it's just snapping to a pose, for example. So even if you're starting from motion capture, you're probably making adjustments. Or if you're starting, I really love seeing just, like, animators, like, posing and, like, filming themselves doing things that they're using just not as motion capture, but for reference for whatever animation they're doing. So there's one article, and I think it was on Game Developer or maybe another similar site, of just, like, they're, like, doing idle poses or, like, different getting up from the ground poses that just, like, pictures of just these normal looking guys. It's very funny.
How many developers have thrown their backs out trying to be like, here, like, I'll demonstrate.
Yeah.
So before we get into all of the very intentional ways that games, like, to be clear, there's just so many different ways that games intentionally say we don't want this to be realistic, right?
Yeah.
Which is so interesting, and I'll be interested to see, especially given, like, the semi-recent release of Sifu and the way they talked about fighting in that game. I'll be interested to see in our current cultural climate of, like, realism above everything else in our games, visual fidelity, whatever, if there starts to be any kind of clamoring for more realistic fighting, and what that form actually takes.
Yeah.
Because, there's things that are more realistic fighting in terms of, like, aesthetics, and then there are things that are more realistic fighting in terms of tricky game mechanic tomfoolery. and one of those is more noticeable to the kinds of people that might cry out for it than the other.
I think it's really interesting to think about trying to make a realistic fighting game, just because, like, you know, when you punch someone in a game, that's not really hitting, the model's not really hitting the other model. Exactly. Probably in some cases it might not. I'm thinking about, this isn't a fighting game, but like in Kirby, it hits when it looks like it hits from the camera angle. A lot of times Kirby is hitting enemies that they're not actually hitting, but to the player it looks like it would hit from the camera angle that it is at, so it hits.
Yeah.
Right? And I think there's a lot of this in games of, you know, you're not actually seeing what is really happening with the models that are on screen, because it is making it so that it looks good to you. Even if you were to pull the camera around, it perhaps would not look as good from other angles.
And it's very similar to stage combat in that way, right? Or movie combat. There are some notable ways in which games are very similar in how they're choreographed to those things, and then other ways that are like, no, that's the opposite. But yeah, definitely like making it, like the view is very important.
Yeah.
Also, like in a real fight, like you'd punch the guy in the face and like it would be over, right? Like your knuckles hurt, the guy's got a broken nose, blood everywhere.
Right.
Like that's it.
Right.
It's not like you're gonna punch, even if you take away like crazy flashy moves. Like these fights lasting more than a few punches is probably not realistic, right? But like that would be lame.
Yeah.
So I do want to, before I get into like games that don't care, right? I do want to talk about Sifu. So I feel like Sifu is, a little bit, if not unique, right? It's definitely flaunting its martial arts bona fides in a way that I think is not typical.
Yeah, they're very intense about it. That's my impression.
Very intense about it. And it does not actually seem like, I mean, maybe you read more about this as well, but in what I read about it, it didn't seem like that was something that they came into the game being like, yes, absolutely, we're going all in on the authenticity front, which is so interesting to me.
I mean, it seemed like they hired a guy and he, you have his name written down, I think.
Benjamin Calusi.
And he was really, like, suggesting, like, why don't you do this? Why don't you do that? And they decided to roll with it, essentially.
Yeah. Well, they had him for a workshop first, though. That's the thing that struck me, is, like, they just had him in for a workshop, which is, like, a pretty normal thing to do, I'm sure, right? Like, have this guy come in and teach your team the basics so they aren't totally reinventing the wheel. But then they were like, let's have him back. And then it felt like he was like, no, like, you're not going to put my name on this if it isn't good.
Yeah. It is. But I mean, it's interesting to contrast their commitment to the fighting style versus their commitment of rendering the culture.
Yeah.
One was greater than the other.
I mean, you know, this guy that they hired is a real Sifu, but he is also from Paris.
Yeah.
Which is fine. Like, they're a French studio. It's probably a lot easier to hire that guy.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So yeah, he did seem kind of demanding. But you do wonder at what point it was like, like, this is the marketing gimmick. And gimmick not full negative, right? Everyone's gotta have a marketing gimmick.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's pretty much all the game is the fighting. So that sort of has to be your marketing gimmick. I mean, they have the aging thing, too.
Right. Getting old, real moves. Exactly. I would, though. I should have found a, like, martial arts people react to Sifu thing for contrast. Because I am curious. It's like, okay, they made a big deal out of this being authentic, and so it's like, yeah, I like believe them, right? Sure. If you're gonna go around like yelling about this everywhere, like it probably is more authentic than a lot of these other games. But I do wonder again, like how much of that is sort of like surface level authenticity, and how much of the still like, well, it's a fighting game, so it needs to feel good. Kind of stuff is still there.
My impression of Sifu is that you can definitely still see the points where the game is accommodating to work.
Yeah.
Right? Like things are, you're turning too fast to catch something because, you know, there's some allowance for doing whatever you have to do, or other things like that. I feel like when you watch it, you can be like, yes, you can see where, even though it's difficult and it's demanding and expects a lot of precision from you, you can see where the game is bending to work well for the person playing the game.
That said, it is based, like, or so I'm told, right? What do I know? I'm not a martial artist. So I'm told it is really consistently based on the Pak Mei Kung Fu style, which, as we've already talked about, like almost everybody else, even if they're in, you know, Street Fighter or Tekken or whatever, and they're like primarily doing capoeira, or they're primarily doing like a specific type of karate or whatever, you know, they're like, a lot of these characters are amalgamations of just moves that are cool together.
Yeah.
And here, you know, one thing that makes it stand out in terms of like authentic is it's like, no, like this guy knows one fighting style. Although that does seem to have been at least somewhat due to time and budget constraints. In the interview that I read, the choreographer was like, well, we didn't have enough time to do motion capture for other styles or like really accurately include them, so we decided to just like keep it simple.
Side note, I did not realize that like the drunken master style is like something with some sort of historical basis to it.
Yeah, I know. It's real.
Because that showed up in one of the compilations, and I was like, wow, this is a lot of very similar moves. I guess they did base this on something.
Just doesn't sound, it's like the name is not doing it any favors.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the thing, is like you like pretend to do that.
Yeah.
For strategic reasons.
It's all about strategic openings.
Yeah.
So speaking of strategy, yeah, let's dive in a little more. We've hinted a lot at all of the ways that games, like even if they're using quote unquote real moves, all the ways that games sort of stretch the truth to make you as the player actually have fun playing the game. You put an interesting Sakurai video on this into our notes.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're not subscribed to Sakurai's YouTube channel, he just releases 3-minute videos every day on little game design principles, and they're frequently interesting. Side
note, I was scrolling through it, and I because I was looking, I was like, oh, does he have more on this stuff so I can dive in a little more? And he did, and I watched a few, but I also watched the one that was like, how do you make yourself, do things?
Yeah.
And his video is you just do it. Get up, turn off the video, you dummy. You just have to do it. Do it.
That does seem like how Sakurai goes through life, to be fair.
He was visualization can help, but forget that. Do it. That was funny.
But I just watched the one on him breaking down attack animations, which you can find a lot of these basic principles in any sort of animation video or talk. But essentially, he goes through that there's you have your standby or your idle pose, which is where the character normally sits when they aren't doing anything. Then you go into your wind up, which is basically anticipation, right? Of I'm getting ready for this move, which both serves to make it feel good, and also serves so that if you're in a fighting game, because he's using Smash as an example, it's showing your opponent what is going to happen as well. Then there's the attack itself when the thing hits, so the moment of impact. And then there's the follow-through, where after the attack, there's a little bit where it keeps going and then goes back into the standby pose. Or in a lot of fighting games, you can cancel before reaching the standby pose as well by dashing or jumping or blocking or whatever.
And just in that sort of 4-sequence, single cycle of an attack, there are so many game tricks that are happening most of the time. Like you said, moving from the standby to the wind-up, right? It's, while in many games, some might even say in most games, we like our animation to be smooth.
Yeah.
Right? We want those FPS firing.
Yep.
But in a fighting game, you still want the FPS firing, I think. I don't know. What does that even mean? I'm just saying words. But in a fighting game, you don't want the wind-up animation to be smooth, because that doesn't feel responsive.
Yeah.
You want to immediately, when you press the button for your character to do the heavy attack or whatever, you want to see them, snap into a wind-up position pretty quickly. And then, hold it there and shake, right? But you want to see that snap happen really fast.
Yeah.
And then holding the wind-up serves, 5 different purposes that don't make any sense if you're thinking about a real fight, right? You hold the wind-up because it's cool, right? You hold the wind-up because, in a fighting game, it gives the other player an opportunity to block, or it creates some kind of an opportunity cost to a heavy attack, right?
Yes.
As opposed to it just being I can do my full damage attack, next frame. And I just, wouldn't really have thought of this because I don't play online games, and, what is rollback netcode? We talked about it on a show. I still don't really understand. I don't understand how the internet works. I don't really understand how anything works.
Fair.
But he also talks about, and I watched a video on the wind-up specifically, that, it covers for input lag, basically. That if you put that wind up there, that it gives it, even if there's some lag, it gives time to catch up, basically, or not be totally out of sync. So it's oh my, right there, that's 4 different reasons that have nothing to do with authentically capturing martial arts, that you kind of have to cheat in that way, and it's going to feel bad if you don't. Which is crazy, just in that, couple of frames. It's already oh, you've already cheated in, 5 different ways, but don't stop.
Yeah. And then, there's, the basic principles of animation that you can apply to anything. The, 10 Disney ones or whatever. Of, I've already mentioned, the squash and stretch you'll probably get if you're dashing or jumping or doing an attack. The smear frames, the example he was using in this video was Link swinging his sword in Smash Bros. Mm-hmm. And when you're using a sword in Smash Bros, it just leaves a whole after image behind it, which swords don't do normally.
I don't believe you.
But
as an expert in medieval weapons history, I don't believe you.
But it gives you the impression of motion without it having to go through that whole motion, essentially. So there's different ways in which we tell the person watching it that the sword moved from here to here without the sword having to the sword can just jump from there to there, essentially.
Yeah. So it weirdly slows it down and speeds it up.
Yep.
At different stages. And some of those match with the places that you would slow down and speed up if you were doing a live stage fight. You probably do hold the wind up for a minute, but you don't jump straight to the wind up.
Yeah.
So it was interesting to me as someone who is formerly certified in unarmed and rapier and dagger stage combat. It was interesting to me to be oh, there are things I recognize here, and there are things that are totally different from what you would do in a
a human can't
fight.
really snap to the wind up.
I realize that I can't snap to the wind-up, like, next frame. I understand that. But you still wouldn't want to do, like, you know, I just demonstrated it in a way that does not help you, listener. But, like, then, like, the snapping to the wind-up doesn't feel good for the audience.
No.
Because they can't follow the story. Whereas snapping to the wind-up feels great for you, the player, because you're like, ah, yes, I did press circle.
The button. Yes.
And there's so much that's about that. There's so much that's about, like, making the player feel like... like what they're doing actually worked.
Yeah. I think that stuff like impact frames and particle effects and everything are so fascinating. This is sort of offhand, but like I think about how, you know, swords, right?
I am familiar.
In animation and even in live action, there'll be like a sound effect when you take a sword out of a sheath, like shing. Swords don't do that. If it's making that noise when it comes out of your scabbard, there's probably something wrong with it.
Yeah.
Or like they'll move the sword and it'll make like a clink clink sound. I don't think your sword should be doing that. But you expect that as the viewer, that you're moving the sword around and it is making noise, right? To emphasize its presence, essentially. Even though that's not really how swords work.
Do you think, and bear with me here, because this is about to be a stupid question, a classic stupid question from me, but, like, where do you think that comes from, right? Like, do you think, this is the stupid question, if I showed, like, a sword fighting, like, Three Musketeers, right? Like, we're not gonna do lightsabers or something, right? But if I showed, like, a sword, like, a filmed sword fight like that to, like, George Washington, right?
Yeah.
Would he be like, why are they making that sound? Or would he be like, ah, pleasing?
I don't know. It's a good question.
You know, assuming that he doesn't have a heart attack and die.
But there's other stuff like this too. Like you're saying, we were playing Lost Judgment, and when there's like a guard break in that, there's like this sort of metallic, like a clicking sound, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, that's not a real sound. But it feels good when you break the guard and it goes krr, you know?
Well, guards themselves are such a thing, right? Like, sorry, not to be like, obviously people can guard against punches in life. The martial artists in the Yakuza 0 video, by the way, really liked one where they were like, he could have guarded, but he just shot the guy's hand instead. Like, love that. Seemingly genuinely. But anyway, like guards are something that, you know, if you don't have guard in a game, unless it's Click Like Boyfriend who doesn't believe in guards, you know, like, that would be weird, right? It'd be weird to have a punchy game where you can't guard, right?
Yeah.
But of course, if you're punching me, Emma, as you've been known to do, and I'm just, like, holding my arm up, like, I might block a couple of those punches, but, like, not without cost to my arm.
Yeah. They should have showed them the scene where there's the guy on the motorbike in the sewers, and he, like, jumps off a motorcycle and hits Kiryu with, like, a steel pipe, and Kiryu blocks it.
Oh, yeah, I do know what you're talking about. I only watched the one where they were reacting to Majima's because I thought the breaker style would be fun, and, you know, I can't watch Yakuza videos all day. They liked Slugger. They did like the baseball bat one for what it was worth. They were like, that seems doable. But no, I didn't watch them. I'm sure there are videos of people reacting to blocking a metal pipe.
I think it's very realistic.
But, like, you know, even, like, that is, like, okay, there's no way. But even if you think about the, like, oh, like, you're blocking someone's kick or, like, punch or something, it's like, you could only do that so many times. And obviously guard breaks are a thing.
Yeah.
You can also only do that so many times before your arm is not really going to be usable.
Yeah. There are some games, and I couldn't think of any examples, but I know that they exist, where guarding only mitigates damage. Like, it does a little bit less while you're guarding, and they really want you to, like, parry or dodge to really, like, get rid of damage entirely. So there is a little bit, there are some games that do think about that, but you can't just, unless you're really going for a full dodgy game, you can't really just eliminate blocks from the equation. There's also stuff like dodge roll.
Yeah.
Sora, the tumbling master, cannot be stopped.
Gotta dodge roll. Always be rolling.
Or stuff, there's stuff like invincibility frames, too, of, like, cheating, of you're in the middle of a dodge roll, and, like, theoretically, if someone was kicking at you in the middle of a dodge roll, they would probably still hit you.
Yeah.
But that doesn't feel great in a game.
No, at least one of the videos or articles I was reading was like, well, wouldn't it be interesting if you could have more of a, like, upper block versus, like, have to actually target your blocks? But that would require, like, again, like, even more telegraphing from an AI character or a human character of, like, where the attack is landing. And also just, like, it would be mechanically difficult.
Fighting games have different level blocks, I believe.
Okay, sure, but, like, even more specifically than that.
Sure, yeah.
Like in the, having some specificity in where the block is, sure, but in a real fight, it's like, no, like, you had better be pretty specific.
Yeah.
But where that block is.
Yeah.
But yeah, you talked about, canceling animations. Obviously, you can't really cancel an animation in
real life, yeah.
And you talked to somewhere about, fighting a mob.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think, like, most players have probably noticed, that when you're fighting a large or medium group of enemies, you could imagine in real life they might all just run at you and then beat you up.
Yeah.
But in games, that feels bad, so they're often quite polite.
Yes. Yes, it was in a talk with a God of War designer about level design with melee combat systems and enemy AI with melee combat systems. And they talked about how, like, generally with crowds and that, everybody will attack you, like, every 2 to 3 seconds on their own. And also, if the player cannot see them, generally they will not be attacking. Because somebody coming off camera and killing you doesn't feel good in a video game. To use the theater thing, if somebody is in the wings and punches the actor on stage, that's not great for the audience because they're like, what happened?
Yeah.
Right? So generally the AI is aware of whether they are on camera or not, and when they are on camera, they will fight, and when they are off camera, they will try to get on camera, essentially.
Yeah. Like actors.
Like actors, exactly. And they also talked about, I thought it was really interesting, of, like, designing a space where you can have, like, a combat system. Because a lot of times with, like, an in-depth action game, the focus is on the fighting. And so if the room is too cluttered, and there's not actually space to move around and perform the moves that have been animated for this character, that's not actually very fun. So a lot of times you'll just have, like, big empty arenas, maybe with a couple of stage hazards, if that's a boss gimmick or something.
Yeah.
Where you can implement your moves. But it doesn't feel realistic that way. So you could also take the more modern Yakuza approach, where things just explode when you touch them in the fight.
Yeah. No, the spacing of items in a fighting space, yeah, I mean, it will tell you a lot about, like, the kind of game that you're working with and character, right? Like, are you playing a character who will grab the bicycle to fight someone? Or, like, the guy in Sifu, I don't think would do that.
Sifu's level designs are more cluttered than a lot of action games, for what it's worth.
Yeah.
Because there are interactions with, like, the furniture and the wall, and stuff like that, I believe. And I think you can pick up some weapons in Sifu.
Sure. I don't mean to say he won't use a weapon. I just mean that he's not going to fight you with a
bike,
milk
yes.
crate.
But just in terms of, like whatever, like this isn't martial arts, but like the Devil May Cry or Bayonetta, like those, they just have like big empty spaces.
Right.
Because you're trying to pull off fancy combos that look cool.
Yeah.
And if, Dante was like tripping over a chair in the middle of his combo and you went down from stylish to dreadful,
yeah,
that wouldn't feel great. Yeah.
Well, that's another important thing that is sometimes true in real martial arts and sometimes not, right? Is that you really want, when you're designing a fighting style, particularly if you're designing a fighting style you have esports ambitions for, right? Like, high-level play needs to look cool.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, you can certainly think of, like, certain types of grappling or whatever that, like, don't really... I mean, whatever. I'm sure they look cool to people who are fans and know what's going on, right? But
yes.
As me, a lay person, like, it doesn't look cool to just see, like, two guys... Like real wrestling, for instance. Like, the difference between real wrestling and pro wrestling here, I think, is real wrestling. And I hope that was clear.
Yeah.
But, like real wrestling, like, is mostly just, like, people trying to get a grip on each other. And, like, it doesn't necessarily look cool at a high level.
There are no sparks and lights.
There are no sparks and lights.
Why isn't there little sparks coming off when one guy grabs the other one, But,
like, you just don't want, like, the cool play to be, like, they do a jab, they do a jab, they do a jab. Like, that can't be, like, the optimal level. Like, that can't be the optimal way to play your game.
Why are they not surrounded with a glowing aura?
Seriously. That's another thing. Real-life martial artists are not surrounded by glowing auras.
I can't believe it, honestly.
That is only in games. I know, listener. You're recovering from that.
It's very disappointing.
Piece of knowledge. But, I mean, researching this made me wish that, like, it's not necessarily that I want more people to go the Sifu route of, like, here's our choreographer. We are doing this 100% accurately, because I don't need that. But I am interested more in, and maybe I should have tried to do more reading on, like, motion capture specifically, right? But I am interested more in, okay, like, how are these, like, fighting style choices made, right? Like, how do you choose, like, why does the combo look just like that?
Yeah.
Because there's just not a lot of, like, media discussion, media interviews about that, and I want some interviews. I enjoy the, like, people analyzing it from the outside, but I also want to hear more about, like, how did you craft this?
Yeah, I just couldn't find very much on that either.
Yeah.
Which is super interesting. It's a lot of people talking about it from the outside, and not a lot of people talking about how they actually put things together from the inside. I imagine some of it's because there are, like, there are basics, right? Of, like, you have a light attack and a heavy attack, and as the combo goes on, like, things get more powerful or whatever, and you want this to toss the enemy, and you want this to knock the enemy away, or whatever. So, because there are things that are shared across all sort of melee fighting systems. But, yeah, it would be interesting to hear about, like, how combat that design happens and how that works with animation as well.
Like, why do they sometimes decide that characters are kicky as opposed to punchy,
yeah,
as opposed to weaponsy, right?
Yeah. And who decides would be really interesting to know. Do they just send the design to the animator in some cases, and the animator's like, this lady punches?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd like to know. I did, one of the things, it's not exactly sort of how they chose this, but I appreciated the sort of diving into the rationale behind the fighting style as opposed to just like, here's a fighting style. With the Spider-Man 2 game coming out with the symbiote suit.
Yeah.
I mean, that's something that they've been handed by the comics to some extent, which helps. But if you're not familiar, right, the symbiote suit is made of alien material of some kind, and it
makes him do the little dance in the street.
Yeah, exactly.
Spider-Man 3.
Exactly. Makes him bad. And so they've, obviously this game is not, like, out yet, right? But they've done some talking about how, like, they thought about introducing that suit in Spider-Man 1, and I really loved the quote in this IGN article where they were like, we thought we were going to get a lot more hate for not including it, which is so emblematic of the Spider-Man suit.
Yeah.
Anytime that it appears in games. But they made the choice. They weren't going to include it in 1 because they didn't want to include it without having, like, a mechanical change, because it is something that changes his powers. So I was like, that's cool. Usually, when, I don't know if Spider-Man can, like, change, I don't think he can change back and forth in this game, but, like, not usually, we don't have too much justification for, like, why does a character have 4 different fighting styles other than it's kind of cool.
Yeah.
Especially when those fighting styles are already, like, this is a mix of 5 martial arts.
But sometimes you got a kicky and sometimes you got a choppy, Alan.
I know. Don't I know it?
Yeah.
I think we all sometimes know that sometimes they got a kicky and sometimes they got a choppy.
Yeah.
But I thought that stood out to me, and of course it stood out to me because it has decades of comic history behind it. So again, it's not necessarily something that I can point and be like, yes, cool, the developers, like, made this up.
Right.
But still, it stood out as a situation where that fighting style is telling you something about the character and is tying into the story in a way that it can sometimes not feel that way. Yeah. I'll say this is for you about Lost Judgment. I don't think, and I think this is true with the RPG games in general, not even just the heat actions, I don't think that the game wants me to believe that this guy is really beating up high schoolers.
Really?
I think that in the universe of the game, the snake style is much more of a use their momentum against them. Because it's sort of that.
It is supposed to be that,
it's
yes.
But
then Yagami does put them against a wall and kick their face.
Yes. So that's what I'm saying. Is that I think the underlying, like, it's a use their momentum against them kind of style is probably what I'm meant to believe is actually happening.
I feel like still should not be using... Like, that's sort of what Aikido is, right? It's more of a defensive style. You still should not be doing that against children.
They came at him with bats.
Okay.
In that, you're right that they shouldn't have beaten them up the first time. I agree. But when the kids come at you with a bat, I think you gotta get out your Aikido. Like, sorry.
Okay.
That struck me after that scene when he did, like, a little bit of fighting in a cutscene. And I was like, oh, I understand that I'm not really supposed to... think that this is happening, like, literally. And I know that in the back of my mind about the RPG games and, like, fighting, like, any game where you fight in general, right? Like, obviously the very brutal, like, no one is actually stomping anybody's skull into the pavement, right? Or, I don't know, I'm sure
Kiryu doesn't kill people.
Right.
We know.
Right.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's like, oh yeah, like, even, like, the normal fighting is probably, like, way more brutal. I mean, like we said, right? Like, the real fight lasts 3 seconds. So in these games where this is, like, a key mechanic, right? It's interesting to then take a step back and say, okay, like, even in the world of the game, this is probably not what I'm meant to think is happening.
I don't know.
Sometimes, anyway.
Sometimes. Anyway, if you want to watch fun combos, I don't think he's really doing it on Twitter anymore, which, like, good for him. But yeah. I used to watch the Sunhee Legend on Twitter, like, edits together, like, perfect little choreographed fights that they do in various games and add, like, slow-mo effects and, like, all this sort of perfect combinations of stuff. So if you ever want to see someone do things cooler than you ever could, that's my recommendation.
There are some combos.
There are some combos.
It was crazy. Well, Emma, I'll ask you. I think we're coming to closing time, coming to the fatality. But what's your favorite like type of fighting style or fighting move in a game?
I like parries. I'm not very good at them all the time, but like in Lost Judgment, for example, the snake style parry, I just did all the time. There was like some character that could like also parry you in that too, I think. So it was sometimes there was just a lot of like we just like pass each other back and forth. You get too far into it. But I like parries a lot. They feel good.
You're a more talented player than me, I see.
And you?
It's like, let's see. I do like a good, like, leg sweep getting up from the ground.
Or the unrealistic don't do
the
that
thing
move.
That they were like, that's a waste of your energy. Just get out. Like, I like that. Like, I want to like grabs, but I'm not good enough at executing them. But, I'm just a basic combo kind of person. I'm
Heck
like, absolutely. Give me a 3 light, 1 heavy. We're good.
That's how you introduced yourself.
I would like Riku does appear for whatever reason. I don't know why. Are there games where Riku punches people? He's on the list of video game martial artists.
Flippies and stuff than Sora does.
He what?
Flippies.
Does that count?
The really technical term of like the flippies. And he like dance dodges away from you.
That doesn't feel like martial arts to me, but
okay,
I'll allow it. I'll also note that I had forgotten that the Wii Fit trainer is in Smash, so it now makes a lot more sense to me. But I did think it was just like, oh, I guess you do some Tai Chi or something in Wii Fit.
Right.
But of course the Wii Fit trainer, I don't think I meant to believe that the Wii Fit trainer in Wii Fit is that violent either.
Yeah.
I don't think that's true. I don't think that's true to the world. I would like to see a Kingdom Hearts game where instead of having the Keyblade, they put like the keys between their fists and punch.
True.
I wouldn't like. I guess that's somebody has claws. Does Larxene have like claws?
She puts her daggers between her fingers like Wolverine.
Yeah, I want that, but with little keys. Like the self-defense when you're like walking on a dark street kind of
right.
energy.
Yeah, you put your keys in between your fingers, right?
Yeah. I'd like that for Kairi. I'd let Kairi fight.
She could definitely do that in, real world area.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. They're like, she gets out there, she's like, oh shoot, my key is just a door key now. And now but it turns out she's been studying martial arts all along.
That's true, that's what she was doing.
She hasn't gotten to fight, because like, you can't fight a giant key with like, judo.
Exactly.
But, next game.
Alright.
Well, listeners, do you wish that martial arts in games or fighting games was more realistic? Do you wish it was less realistic? Are there ways that games cheat to make us feel good that we didn't even talk about today? I'm sure there are like a bajillion. Mm-hmm. If you have thoughts on this or anything else we talked about this week, you can hit us up on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games in the hat, and read our blog featuring long-running series Click Like Boyfriend and Split Screen. But if you enjoyed the show, the most important thing that you can do, and the thing that you will enjoy the most, is to subscribe. We are on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts, online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Cast, wherever you can find podcasts, wherever you found the podcast today, subscribe to Talk This. Next week, we are talking about an old game and a new game.
Talking about Wild Arms and Fear and Hunger 2.
Right. 2 games that I had not heard of. So I look forward to that. A learning time for me. Mm-hmm. And in 2 weeks, it'll be Emma's side quest.
I don't know what we're doing yet.
I can send you I started to finally like write down a little notes list on my phone of like, so the next time I'll try to think of a side quest.
No,
I'm
you
not
keep
just
it,
like,
you keep it.
Let's do a side quest on security at events Jeff is hosting.
We maybe should, honestly.
Let's do a side quest on Bill Clinton's impact on the gaming industry.
Oh boy.
It's probably deep.
Probably. Well, would you sign us off? Would you kick us out?
Nice. Listeners, I hope this week that if anybody tries to punch you, that it's well telegraphed and your block is strong.